Welcome, thinkers, to Season 3, Episode 8. Today's topic is mashups. And today I'm joined by Jeff Greiner from the Tome Show. Thank you ever so much for joining us today, Jeff. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure, yeah, I'm happy to be here. So my name is Jeff Greiner. I am the founder, producer, whatever you want to call it, for the Tome Show. I've been podcasting as the Tome Show for 15-ish years now. It is a D&D focused podcast. We do news, reviews, interviews, book clubs, whatever, right? We've got some actual play going on in there as well. But whatever it is, it's D&D focused. And it basically started in 2006 because it was a podcast that I wanted to have to exist, and nobody was doing D&D podcasts. And so I so far as I know, I got to it first. I don't know that there was there is a D&D podcast around today that was around back then as well, that has been going continuously that whole time. So that's me. I'm a 42-year-old man on the Eastern time zone of the United States who's been playing D&D since I was 8. Started with 2nd edition back in the 80s. So I've been playing D&D a lot, and I don't know, probably the last 20 years of that has been primarily as a dungeon master.
Amazing. I can only hope that my podcast has the longevity of yours.
That's mostly stubbornness.
Yeah. In which case, then it probably will do, knowing me. So yeah.
Okay.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. The topic of today's discussion is mashups. So what does that term mean to you in the D&D framework?
Yeah. So the idea of mashups in RPGs or whatever, right, is take two things that don't necessarily feel like they are inherently combined and combine them anyway, and see what kind of weird awesomeness comes out of it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Have you got any for the sake of the listeners? Obviously, I know
Sure.
what you're talking about. For the sake of the listeners, have you got any like really poignant examples, like really crystal clear examples of like a classic?
This topic came to me because I've had this situation where since 5th edition came out, they've had a relatively slow release schedule, right? They put out, a couple of adventures a year,
Mm-hmm.
And maybe some other books along the way. But those first few years, even, it was just 2 books a year, and that was all they did for several years. And that was actually about right. That was about perfect for me. But even then, like, a single campaign with one of those adventures might take me a year and a half to run.
Mm-hmm.
And so my solution to that was, let's just take a bunch of adventures, a bunch of these, 1 to what are they tend to go 12 or 1 to 15 campaigns, and let's make them into one story, right?
Okay.
And so my first experience with this was I ran Out of the Abyss, Princes of the Apocalypse, and then I pulled up an old 2nd edition module called The Rod of 7 Parts, and they all happened simultaneously on top of each other, and I ran that as my campaign. I mashed up all these different adventures in actually a setting that is also a mashup. Because another thing that you can mash up in games is you can mash up sort of the genres and the themes of the game. And so the setting that I ran that for was, I called it Post-Apocalyptic Fantasy Earth.
Okay.
Right? So it is simultaneously kind of post-apocalyptic, but also high fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
But, there's large, fantasy cities built into the rusting hulls of old battleships or whatever,
Yeah.
And so... So I mashed up the setting in my mashed up campaign of adventures as well.
Okay. So there's quite a few things there then that I've sprinkled throughout my notes. But let's start with the big one then, in terms of combining published modules. And now I'm very much a Padawan in this situation, having never run a single, or even played, I think, in a single published module. In terms of like a WotC published module, I might have played a little something from DM's Guild or something for a one shot. But so how trivial is that to do then, to to take two separate books published 12 months apart, however long, and smushing them together in a way that is still enjoyable entertainment for everybody at the table?
Sure. So it depends on both how you want to do it, and at least for me, the hard part is, I don't know, the beginnings of doing this work for me is the narrative. I look at Princes of the Apocalypse, I looked at Out of the Abyss, and I'm like, well, there's kind of this shared narrative of some sort of powerful force for chaos wanting to be unleashed upon the world and do horrible things. And then I looked at the Rod of Seven Parts, and I don't even know why I was looking at the Rod of Seven Parts, that old second edition module, but it has a similar story, right? So in Out of the Abyss, that's the demon lords have been unleashed upon the Underdark, and they're rampaging throughout, and it's all sort of this plot by Lolth.
Oh, okay.
Right? In Princes of the Apocalypse, the ancient evil Tharizdun, who has been around since first edition, I think, D&D, originally I think Greyhawk, is trying to escape his prison. Like Tharizdun is sort of that classic, like horrible creature, so horrible that even the good and evil gods aligned together to imprison them, because they could not destroy him, right? And so that's Tharizdun. And he's, trying to, through his cult, is trying to bring one of his evil elemental princes, back to the world. And then the evil elemental princes are powerful enough to maybe release him from his prison. And then the Rod of Seven Parts is appropriately titled, there are these 7 parts of a rod scattered around. And when you find one of them, it starts leading you to the next one and the next one and the next one. And this rod is of there are other agents seeking the parts of this rod that work for an entity known as Mishka the Wolf Spider. Mishka the Wolf Spider is the exact same sort of character as Tharizdun. It is a horrible evil that the gods had to team up to imprison but couldn't kill sort of character. And the only thing that could possibly destroy Mishka is the Rod of Seven Parts when it's combined, right? And so I looked at that and I said, well, 2 of those, like, why not just say that Mishka and Tharizdun are the same character with a different name in different cultures, right? Yeah. Done. The Rod of Seven Parts, that original adventure, is actually written in such a way that it's not supposed to be a continuous campaign so much as a series of events in a campaign that are sprinkled throughout other adventures.
Oh,
so that's,
okay. Yeah.
You're supposed to fit it into other things, right? So that's easy enough. And then I decided, well, and clearly Lolth is doing what she's doing in the Underdark as part of an arrangement that she's made with Miska / Tharizdun, right? Create some chaos, distract all the heroes dealing with all these demon lords running around so that Mishka can run around and collect the rod pieces, which is also what it needs. Not only is it the one thing that can possibly destroy Mishka, but it's also the one thing that Mishka needs in order to escape its prison, right?
Yes, the classic double-edged sword kind of thing, yeah.
Right, yeah. And so I'm like, I want to do 2 things at once because I don't have time to do one of these adventures quickly enough, you know? And I kind of want to experience all these stories. And so I mashed them up together. And I started with, well, so I guess the question you were asking was about how much work is it? How hard is it? So in that case, it took a little bit more work. Once I realized there was a shared narrative that I could weave the stories together in a way that made sense. You still have to be willing to chuck parts of the story that exist in the published adventures, right? Because clearly, like, the timelines don't work, because all of them are pretty much like, oh my gosh, horrible things are happening. We have to deal with it right now. Yeah, but you can't deal with all of the horrible things simultaneously. The Rod of Seven Parts is built to do that, but none of the other adventures are. So you have to be willing to tweak the timeline a little bit, completely eliminate certain chunks of the story, of one story, in order to fit it into the other. And then the trick really is figuring out how you're going to transition back and forth from one to the other, right? What are the, when the PCs are in the middle of dealing with this one storyline, what is going to pull them out of that storyline to go deal with this other thing? and then go back and forth. So you're not just doing one after another, but you're sprinkling them all throughout, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that way of doing it is a little bit more work. In terms of, I don't know, I just spent a lot of my time thinking about it, right?
Yeah.
On my commutes to work or in the shower or whatever, right? Doing the dishes. I'm thinking about, okay, how do I do this? Oh, and I could connect that, and then I could run over there. And I actually at one point was also sprinkling in and tying it into the Green Ronin classic adventure, Freeport Adventures. I don't know if you're familiar with those.
That doesn't ring a bell, no.
So Freeport is this sort of pirate city on an island, and it's so it's a bit of a hive of scum and villainy, if you will.
Yep.
But it also has this Cthulhuoid sort of thing going on with this horrible destroyer that's trying to break free and all that kind of stuff. So that kind of fit really well. But when presenting all of the things going on to the players, that one was the thing that they're like, that's a long ways away, and we'll maybe deal with that later. And they just never quite got around to it. So that part of the campaign just sort of, sometimes the players tell you what they want to do. And that wasn't what they wanted to do.
Yeah.
So we didn't do that part. I did actually run at one point when I needed a little bit of a break. From the normal campaign, I did run a one shot of like the first part of that Freeport adventure with different characters, just to be like, hey, that thing you never dealt with, here's what was going on, and who took care of it. I know these other characters of yours that took care of it.
Yeah.
And so that is one way that I mashed up adventures, and it was a good amount of work in terms of contemplating how they all fit together and what have you. But once, I don't know, the way my brain works, once I start to see the connections in my head, then that becomes my classic headcanon, and that's the only thing that makes sense anymore, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So then it's just a matter of figuring out how to weave the story together and have the players doing interesting things.
Mm-hmm.
The other way I've done it is actually much easier. My current campaign is also a mashup of Dragon Heist Waterdeep and Curse of Strahd.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Right? But Curse of Strahd is an adventure that it really starts at level 3. It goes 3 to 12, and Dragon Heist Waterdeep is 1 to 5. And so I just made the beginning parts of Curse of Strahd a little bit harder. And, so I ran Dragon Heist Waterdeep, and then transitioned that into Curse of Strahd. And I threw in a little bit of Tales of the Old Margrave from Kobold Press as well, just to transition some things. But that worked out. That's a much easier mashup to do because you're just focusing on one adventure at a time. Now, I still find when doing that, I get a lot of benefit, I guess, out of thinking about what I'm going to do ahead of time. So I knew I was going to run Curse of Strahd after Dragon Heist Waterdeep. So I layered in a bunch of Curse of Strahd sort of clues in those first 5 chapters.
Foreshadowing.
Yeah, absolutely. So every now and then the mists would roll through and something would disappear from the city of Waterdeep. Or there was an old fortune teller who took up residence in Trollskull Alley just down the street from where the characters get their own tavern or whatever, who was actually a what are they called? The travelers, based on the Roma people. What are they called?
Oh, the Vistani.
Yes, the Vistani. Yeah. So there was this old Vistani woman who was doing fortune telling in a little shack down the street from Trollskull Manor that they'd run into every now and then, or would come out and creepily tell them their fortune whether they wanted it or not. And it turns out that she is the sister of Madame Ava from the Vistani in Barovia, and she actually gave them a map of Barovia 3 levels before they went there. They already had a map of it. Like, I don't know what this place is. This doesn't match any place in the world that we know of. I don't know what this lady's talking about, right? So I sprinkled in all these hints in the middle of Dragon Heist Waterdeep that there was this other strange thing going on.
Happening, on the horizon. One thing I've learned from doing the show is that, as I said, I am not super familiar with running published modules. I know them by name and infamy in some cases.
Sure.
But a lot of my guests have done them, and having to edit them, I guess is the best way to put it, is a common a common theme. It's very rarely have I ever spoken to someone that was just like, yeah, I just ran that publish module verbatim, line for line. I didn't have to change anything.
Now on one, and I don't know. We talk about this a lot on my show as well. And there's a lot of work that people feel like they need to do, but it's interesting because for some people, the amount of work it shouldn't be there.
Mm-hmm.
And for other people, but that's how D&D has and always, and probably should work, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because you should be customizing the modules to make them, really be fun for you and for your players and connect it to their characters and what have you, right? So for the most part, I would recommend changing modules, any module, regardless of how good or thorough it is, just to make it, customize it and make it more yours.
Yeah.
I don't know. I didn't do much customization of Dragon Heist Waterdeep other than throwing in some extra things for them to do and connecting it to the Ravenloft piece because I knew that's where they were going. And in the near future, I'm going to be running The Wild Beyond the Witchlight, and I don't know that I'm gonna add to, but I don't really feel like it needs changes. I feel like Descent into Avernus is one of my favorites right now, but in order to drive the story, I feel like I really want it to have a stronger opening.
Yeah.
And I've heard that a lot from other people, and I think it can run as is if you have cooperative players who are like, okay, fine, we're going to go along with the story that you want to tell, right?
Yeah. Which we all know is often not always the case.
Right. But I feel like it for some groups it needs some more help. Like it has an opening, oh no, something horrible has happened to El Torel. But the story kind of assumes you're not from El Torel and you're from Baldur's Gate, which is a city that doesn't always get along very well with El Torel. So you could very easily have a bunch of players who are like, all right, cool, bye, and then let it go. So I think there are some good DM's Guild adventures that I like to tack onto things, right? And I don't consider that usually like taking other adventures and including them or smaller pieces or whatever and including them in a campaign. I don't know that I consider that mashing up. I guess some people might. Like I was telling you about my current campaign where we did Dragon Heist and then Curse of Strahd. But that really only gets you through like the second act of the story. And then the third act is more or less homebrew.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, like Curse of Strahd is a really good adventure, but it ends with, and then we went back home and everything was back to the way it was. And that's not real satisfying. You didn't really accomplish anything other than just surviving, which I guess is classic for a horror story, right?
Yeah.
But I didn't start it off as just Curse of Strahd. I started it off with Dragon Heist Waterdeep and this high fantasy, and so you want to feel like you accomplished something big. So my whole third act is kind of homebrew in terms of I played with the whole Curse of Strahd thing and the dark powers that created the domains. They wanted Strahd to be defeated, so Barovia would come back and they could be released from their prison. And now the dark powers are running around in my world and choosing champions all over the place. And now they're trying to put the lightning back in a bottle.
A classic, like you've killed something that was keeping back something worse, like a greater evil. Yeah. Oh no, what have we done?
So that whole act is I think of my campaign in 3 acts. So the whole third act is all homebrew, but within that homebrew, I'm like, oh, well, one of these champions of the dark powers you need to hunt down happens to be a Sararak, so let's go run the tomb from Tomb of Annihilation. We skipped the entire rest of the adventure. We just ran the dungeon, right? And then I pulled a couple of the adventures from Candlekeep Mysteries and that were higher level than fit well, and we ran those. And right now they're in Yithrin, which is the sort of final location in Rime of the Frost Maiden. Those are not things I really considered mashing up because I'm not really playing with those stories from those adventures much at all.
Pick and mix, yeah.
But I'm pulling, basically pulling locations and dungeons and whatever out and tying it into my existing story.
Yeah, I think one thing that you mentioned earlier on that I wanted to talk about is you said I think Descent into Avernus. You said is one of your favorite adventures, and that got me thinking like about replayability for players rather than the DMs can run it, and it can be different every time because the players are different. But in terms of like, I know it'll be different with a different group of players, but broadly they're gonna know what the big story beats are. And I was thinking mashing up published adventures is probably a very good solution to that, to remix. So you're you're ostensibly still doing, say, Descent into Avernus, but as you've done yourself in the past, you mash it up in some way, you mix it up with something else, and suddenly even the veteran player is like, oh, we're not doing that, we're doing some other interesting thing, and suddenly they're back, their interest is piqued again. So that's probably a good way to abuse those published modules in a way to kind of keep things fresh and unique without the potentially heavyweight baggage of completely homebrewing something, which is what I'm doing here.
That feels right to me. I haven't used it that way, but that feels like that would be the case, right? Now, a lot of the adventures have published adventures, like any good story, right? Has surprise moments and whatever. If you wanted to use it to make it fresh again and give it some replayability, I think that would work. But you might want to rethink those twists or those surprises and make the surprise something that connects to the new story you're mashing it up with, so that there is still like some shock or some surprise to it, I've even half considered, I don't think I'm going to do it, but I've half considered mashing up Descent into Avernus with The Wild Beyond the Witchlight.
Okay.
Not to be overly spoilery for folks, but there is a surprising connection at the end of Witchlight that could make it work, I think, pretty well. The only thing that's going to stop me from doing it, I think, is the fact that I actually bought the Platinum Edition from Beetle and Grimm of both of those adventures. Yeah. And so I want to use every bit of it because those are expensive. So I want to use every morsel. Yeah, absolutely. Those are the only Beetle and Grimm products I've bought, are those two. And they happen to be two that I think would mash up pretty well, but I don't want to miss out on all of the early stuff from Descent into Avernus by using Witchlight instead. So
yeah. No, I love the one thing I surprisingly haven't talked about on the show, despite talking about everything from homebrew and designing encounters and NPCs and monsters and publishing and making your own adventures and all that kind of stuff. One thing that I think is unique is this exercise, is this thought process of mashing up published adventures. We've talked about running them before, we've talked about customizing them, but this way of thinking about them in such a way that they can become greater than the whole of the whole is greater than the sum of its parts kind of thing is quite a unique exercise to do. I mean, I certainly wouldn't be any good at it if I were to start today. But that is, I've never, that thought process, those particular set of neurons haven't fired in my head yet. And I'm like, yeah, that's a unique challenge in the DM sphere.
Well, I mean, it's not, I don't know. Like I said, I started back in the second edition days, right? And it wasn't until even partway through third edition that like published adventures were campaigns. Like that's not a thing. That's really a thing that Paizo started doing when they took over Dungeon and Dragon magazine way back in the day, before they split off and started Pathfinder. They started publishing these adventure paths, right? That's really the first time the D&D companies, or the companies that publish for D&D, really started thinking about campaigns, publishing whole campaigns. The norm for so long was just like, well, here's an adventure, and it might cover 3 to 5 sessions or whatever. And so it was the standard operating procedure of like, hey, I've got this adventure, I've got that adventure. Let's just figure out a way to make them all happen in the one campaign, and just sort of keep going and keep playing for as long as we have fun adventures to play, right?
Yeah.
And there was a point in, I remember back in my high school days, there was a point where it was like, hey, I had my group of players, we were all friends, we hung out together, and we all had, dozens of characters that we've played through different adventures or whatever. And so every now and then somebody would be like, hey, I got an adventure I want to run. Find a character that you've got that's 12th to 14th level. Or this is a first level one, and then we all start new characters or whatever it is, right? And so we all had this library, and it was just whoever wanted to run a new adventure, tell us what level it should be, and then piece it together, right? But so I guess the point being, like, mashing up these adventures it's a logical progression from, well, we used to just take all these smaller adventures and kind of string them together and make them work. Now they're not publishing smaller adventures very often, or when they do, it's these anthologies like Candlekeep Mysteries or Salt March or whatever, right? Which I actually didn't even mention that. I stole a bunch of stuff out of Ghosts of Salt March for the Dragon Heist Waterdeep section of that campaign too. But yeah, so I mean, it's a logical progression from doing all of that and taking all these disparate sort of adventures and piecing them together and stringing them together into one campaign. And then going to, okay, well, now I've got these big campaigns that run for 10 levels or more. It's not that much of a mental leap to start doing that. At least it wasn't for me, but I guess I've been playing for a minute, so.
Yeah, just a few. Yeah. One we mentioned it earlier on around changing the theme, I guess, or genre is maybe a better word to use, let me bring it back on topic professionally, is the mashing up genres in a particular campaign. So now I don't know too much about those published modules, apart from I know Curse of Strahd is very what's the word? Not overbearing, but like ominous and
It's trying to play on your classic sort of Victorian horror tropes.
Yeah, and then you mentioned the one that was in like a Pirate Bay, but a little bit Lovecraftian. So they've all got their tropes and stuff. My homebrew campaign, the one that I've been running for quite some time, here's my trouble when it comes to world building, and it's a bed that I've made for myself. But each of the chapters in that, I've said it before, but I'll say it again, is that I really wanted those to be self-contained for starters, as in they have a beginning and a middle of an end. Probably a bit like the Rod of the Seven Parts, right? There's each one is a mission to go and get something, and a MacGuffin, and bring it back. And also, I really wanted the theming to be really strong. So when it comes to building the world that all of these, it's almost like an anime, right? So each episode, each campaign is like, this is the water episode, this is the beach episode, this is the. So somehow I've got to string together getting the players from like, you're deep underground in dwarven territory, and the next chapter I've kind of got to help you get back from there all the way up to the elven city in the clouds, because you're off to high fantasy future technology escalator lift world.
So you've got a good sort of genre thematic sort of mashup going on there, because you have them going to all these different sort of locations that have extremely different sort of feels.
Yeah, and I've even done it wasn't quite well, actually it was a little bit like Barovia, in that it was I probably cribbed more from that subconsciously than I have ever thought about in the past, but it was very much like a rundown, predominantly human settlement, like ex-farming settlement, has some kind of curse which has basically killed all the crops, and it's always just grey and raining, and the signs are falling off the shops.
That feels like Barovia to me.
Yeah. Now I'm saying it. It's cribbed. I think it could well have been lift and shifted from the Shadowfell, like in the blink of an eye. But that was very much a theme I was going for. And I was just like a hop, skip, and a 2 days ride from the capital city of this continent, which is thriving megapolis. So yeah, trying to smush those together. I've been quite happy that I guess quite lucky that my players have, as you said earlier on, like are happy to meet me halfway and kind of like, okay, I know what Danlo's going for here. Let's buckle up and let's settle in for the for the journey.
Well, and like that's a whole way of thinking about and doing things that I think provides some interesting variety that helps a campaign thrive. If I ran a campaign from first level to 20th level and it was all doom and gloom and dark and ominous like Barovia the entire time, like that would get tiresome, right? There was a point playing through Curse of Strahd where the players were, I think, starting to feel the same thing that their characters were feeling. Like it is just nothing but doom and gloom for a long time, and oppressive, and yeah, absolutely. So once we got out, it was like, okay, now I'm homebrewing the rest of the Act 3, like I mentioned, right? And so I've very purposely been like, okay, what can I do? What kind of little vignettes can we do? These little encounters or smaller adventures or whatever can we do that is allowing us to explore these different genres, right? Now, it's not so blatant as like I'm purposely genre mashing, but I'm mixing up a little bit of my story, right? And so when you've been through Curse of Strahd, the next big adventure that they ran through was a mega death trap dungeon from Tomb of Annihilation, right? And then I threw in a little bit of I pulled the mass combat rules that they had an Unearthed Arcana for mass combat, right?
Yeah.
And we did this sort of the Battle of El Torel, trying to save the Holy City, sort of adventure at one point, and we pulled from Candlekeep Mysteries and did these sort of small little mysteries, and one of them that was actually written by a friend of mine, Brenda Stoddard, has to do heavily with the Fae, and so we got to bring in a little bit of Fae stuff with our story as well, and so that's allowed to break it up a little bit, to have the campaign go for a long time. We've been playing this campaign for almost 2.5 years.
Okay.
And I think if you just did a campaign with one sort of genre or theme throughout for 2.5 years, it would possibly become tiresome, right? So by switching it up, that makes it more interesting. Now, what's sometimes more interesting to me, or at least what can in the short term, what can make really interesting things is mashing up and combining these genres or these themes at one time, right?
Okay.
Like we talked about Freeport being, it is pirates, but it is also Lovecraftian. The classic is the Dresden Files, right? It is detective noir, but it is fantasy, right? And so I like the idea. Whenever I need a new idea, and I want to try to make something or create something and make it interesting or unique, my go-to is, okay, well, I'm kind of interested in this theme, and I'm kind of interested in this theme. What would it look like if those two themes were on top of each other, right? And what kind of weird and unique things does that create in my brain?
Yeah, all I can think of now is like a crafting system in a video game. Like when you take nails and a baseball bat and you take it to the crafting bench and you make a baseball bat with nails in. The zombie game escapes me, but that is the same way, but you could do that with genres in real life. Like, what if I take X and Y and smush them together and see what unique things happen?
Honestly, it's more interesting, I think, when you do it with a genre. If I have nails and I have a baseball bat and I get a baseball bat with nails in it, that's the logical conclusion, right? That's not weird and quirky. that is exactly what you would expect nails to do with a baseball bat, right?
Yes.
But if I take high fantasy and post-apocalyptic and end up with Dark Sun, like, that is weird and unique, and that is not what you would have expected. That is a whole different genre because you took these two other themes and mashed them up, right? I assume you're familiar with Dark Sun.
I've heard of it.
Yeah, I guess if you've been playing mostly in 5th edition, you mean so Dark Sun was a 2nd edition setting that they republished in 4th. And the whole idea was, it's a desert setting, and there's these sort of independent city-states ruled by these sorcerer kings who practice a type of magic that drains the life out of the world as they do it, which is how the world became a desert, right? It used to be this lush green environment, and basically magic was the apocalypse. These power-hungry people used this magic that drained the world of life. And so, and they're oppressive, and it's got slavery. And back in the 2nd edition days, it was, if you played a Dark Sun campaign, you started at level 5 because levels 1 through 4 just can't survive. It's too difficult. It's too hard ass. So it's just there's no metal. So everything, all your weapons and things are made out of obsidian, but what that also means there's a breaking mechanic. Like, you could just hit something and your sword shatters, and now you don't have a sword. And, your armor isn't made out of leather because there's not a lot of life teeming around, and a lot of it is chitinous sort of bug-like creatures or whatever. And so your leather armor might have been woven from the hair of a giant, or that kind of stuff, right? And psionics were influential. Clerics weren't really a thing, but they kind of were, but they were all tied to various elements, and so even then there was a bit of a harshness to it. That was somebody back in the 2nd edition days saying, hey, what if we take a classic fantasy setting. What if we take a Greyhawk or a Forgotten Realms or whatever and say that the bad guys won, the world is destroyed, and it's been hundreds of years, thousands of years, whatever. Now what's going on? Now what does that world look like, right? Yeah. It's a classic sort of mashup setting of let's take post-apocalyptic and fantasy and do it in one setting.
Those kind of questions are the interesting kinds of questions. What would it look like if X and Y are like,
right?
And you can replace those variables with any, the bad guys won and it's in the future. Like you could just almost, there's a way of generating maps where you just roll dice on a table and draw around, the dice. And you could probably do that with that hypothetical question. You could just have a dice table and roll it and just be like, what the next arc of my campaign is going to be if X happened and Y happened. And then that can be such a creative exercise there for the DM to think about, like, what would that actually look like?
Well, and you do that kind of thing with the maps, and that raises all kinds of, I don't know, maybe. I've spent most of my life as a social studies educator, right? And so geography is a thing that I've taught a lot. And so I think about rolling the dice randomly on a piece of paper and drawing around it. And, each number represents a different sort of geographic feature. Yes. And then that's going to create lots of moments where it's like, those things don't make sense next to each other.
Is this like an abhorrent idea to you? Have I offended you by...
No, because that becomes an opportunity. I look at that like, this doesn't make sense next to each other. So now I get to come up with some kind of weird, crazy, magical thing that's causing it, right? And I get to tell a weird story. Like, that actually isn't a mountain. It's a dead god who, the stone just sort of formed up around them when they died. And that's why there's a mountain next to that spot where there shouldn't be a mountain or whatever.
Yeah. Or why the rivers are splitting upstream and stuff like that is...
Yeah. What happened there? And how does that happen? What caused that?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So that's a very good, classic, another creative exercise there to get those creative juices flowing. And it's probably stuff I should leverage a bit more rather than just kind of trying to make everything up from day one, which is what leads to me needing to have DM holidays. So we've talked a lot so far around specifically D&D and the published adventures and stuff around that. I had a question, I don't know, maybe this is like a really stupid question, but that's the tightrope I walk with this show. Has there ever been anybody or any desire or inclination by anyone to kind of smush different TTRPG systems together? Because there isn't, there's no single one TTRPG system which is the best. That everybody has, everything has drawbacks or is tailored to a certain way of playing. And while preparing for this episode, I was thinking, surely someone at some point must have gone, I like the D20 system, but I love how this other system does combat encounters. Yeah. How can I push those two together? And to me, that seems like, that must happen all the time. But I can't say I've ever stumbled across anything like that.
I mean, I know there was certainly a time in my youth where I was like, I'm going to create a new RPG game or whatever. And then you look back at it, it's like, no, it was really just me saying I really liked this game and I really like this game, so I'm going to just throw my favorite parts of both of them together. And it never really worked. It was a practice of immaturity, but no, but it was fun at the time, right? It was an exercise to keep my mind busy. I think, again, I don't know that I would call it mashing up systems, but it is not uncommon to take ideas from one game and lift them and use them in another game. Sort of like, I don't consider running the dungeon from Tomb of Annihilation really mashing it up, because I'm not combining the stories. But like when, I don't know if you're familiar with the game Fiasco.
Yeah, played it once before. Yeah, right? I've got the books downstairs, yeah.
So Fiasco opens up with this sort of, you build relationships with each other, right? So you've got some connection to the person next to you. Here's a list of possible ways that you could be connected. Let's decide randomly, and then you tell me what that story is, right? I've done that a bunch, and actually, I think I originally stole that idea of using that in D&D from Mike Shea from Sly Flourish, who's a friend of mine. And so I think he originally, years ago, we talked about this. And so I've done that pretty regularly now as a session 0 for my D&D campaigns. That way nobody's starting off unconnected. It's not just a group of strangers and I've got to figure out some way to get them together. It's a group of interconnected people.
Yeah.
And they may not all know each other, but enough of them know enough about each other that it makes sense that they would kind of come together in that web, right?
Yeah.
Or another thing that I've seen done, I haven't done it myself, but there is a game called, I think it's Microscope.
Okay.
And in Microscope, you actually are creating a world, you're creating a setting. And so I've talked to several people who have talked about like you playing the game Microscope to create a setting and then playing D&D in that setting.
Oh, okay.
Right? Or one of the, I'm not a huge fan of like the chase mechanics in D&D that exist in the DMG, right? They're all right, but they're not super like dynamic or exciting. And so when I had some chases that I needed to run in Dragon Heist Waterdeep, rather than using those mechanics, I kind of took those mechanics and mashed them up with the chase mechanics from Torg Eternity. Speaking of mashups, that's a whole game built around mashing up. We can talk about that. So Torg Eternity is intentionally a more sort of cinematic game.
Yes, right, okay.
So the chase mechanics there can be pretty dynamic and exciting and whatever. And so I took the Torg Eternity chase mechanics and mashed it up with the D&D chase mechanics for that location and the obstacles that they presented and did it that way. And that worked pretty well. So that's sort of how I think about mashing up game systems. But I also think there's a lot of value in recognizing that like system matters when it comes to telling a story, right? And some systems are better at telling certain kinds of stories. And so if you're going to mash up things from other systems into your game, then I think it's worth bearing that in mind. Like D&D is a game full of mechanics that facilitate telling a certain kind of story. Other games, Fiasco is not telling that kind of story.
No.
Right? So you can steal some ideas, but I would shy away from like completely creating a hodgepodge system that tries to do it all, because it means that it's probably not going to be telling the kind of story that you want to be telling as well as it could.
Yeah, it's going to dilute the experience a little bit, but I really love the idea there that the system that you're playing impacts the story. I think it's because sometimes it can be a little bit of a taboo thought. Like you can tell any story you want in D&D 5e, but I think ultimately that the framework that's there inevitably impacts it emphasizes some things and isn't very good at other things, like chases, for example. And I think that inevitably shifts the focus, maybe consciously or not, of people writing, homebrew and stuff and making their own games. It's just kind of there at the back of your mind that it encourages certain play styles. And
there was a real desire for a long time, I feel like, in the game industry to have, sort of the one system to rule them all, right? The one game system that can just sort of do anything. And there are certainly systems that can tell any kind of story, but that doesn't mean that the game runs the same, right? D&D has a certain feel when you're playing it at the table, regardless of the story you're telling within that, right? Whereas like Fate, I think, is a game that can run pretty much any game in any genre and any setting, right? It can do just about anything, but it is a very sort of narrative. I don't know if you've played Fate before.
No, I only know it by name.
Yeah, so Fate is very much about giving players narrative control at different moments, and it's all about building narrative. And so there's not a lot of concern about combat game balance, because that's not, there's certainly a tactical element to playing D&D.
Yeah, oh, for sure.
There's not a tactical element to playing Fate. It's all about the narrative and the story you want to tell. So it can tell any story, but it feels very different.
Yes, yeah, that feeling, yeah.
I and my players are not always in the mood for this very narrative focused thing. We want to tell stories, we want to have a narrative, but we want to do it and have this element of tactics and strategy and growth, character development and leveling up and doing all those fun things that we do in D&D as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. It's very, very well put. Yeah, I think that's pretty much the nail on the head there in terms of answering my original question as to why somebody hasn't tried to make the silver bullet. Right. And it's probably because it just probably won't work or won't be suitable for most games, in a cruel twist of irony.
Well, I mean, people certainly have. I think it was Steve Jackson Games way back in the 80s and 90s had a system called GURPS.
Oh yes, yeah, I heard of that.
Which stands for Generic Universal Role Playing. It was sort of a generic system, and then they had all these different modules you could use to use GURPS to tell all these different kinds of stories. Mm-hmm. I just don't know that it. I mean, I don't know. I never played GURPS. I know lots of people who did and really loved it. I have to imagine it also, though, has its own specific feel, independent of genre.
Yeah, well, there'll be some concessions made along the way to make it generic, which, again, invariably affects something for better or for worse.
Now, did I get the impression earlier that you've played Torg?
No.
Oh, okay.
well, you might well have done, but it was wrong.
Okay. I when I was referencing Torg Eternity, you were responding in a way that you seemed familiar with it, but
that's a high charisma roll on my part.
Yeah. You got me with your deception checks, or I just bombed my whatever it is.
Insight, yeah.
Insight, yeah.
No, Fiasco, yes, we played once, and the guy actually gave me the books after we're done with them, so we sitting downstairs. I do need to go back to that, but thank you for reminding me, actually, because I kick myself because having the PCs have that 6 degrees of separation between them is such an elegant solution to that first session 1 issue of getting people together, and I'm kicking myself for not having done that despite having played Fiasco before starting my campaign.
Yeah, no, I'm certain I stole that idea of using that from Mike Shea, but it is I hate to give Mike more a bigger head than he already has, but it was a brilliant idea. He has lots of brilliant ideas. So
yeah, it doesn't even have to be like you're their brother or their long lost brother. It can just be like you worked in their bar once, 10 years ago or something, and you owe them money and you ran, something is, that's why it's fun, right? Because you can kind of, as you said in session 0, you can just kind of build that world together and invest the players, and they haven't even started playing yet, which is the best kind of investment.
Yeah, no, it's a system that works really well. And then a lot of times I'll build those relationships, but I'll also connect them to something else in the story. So it was, the two of you know each other from this location that I know is going to show up later on in the story. Right? And then you get to completely make up what did you do in that location? How do you know each other? What happened? Whatever. But now I've connected you to each other, and I've also connected you to this location that is going to be important later on in the campaign.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. No, I love that. Yeah, that's great, because you're giving them free reign then to invent, do the world building dynamically, which is great. So we've talked briefly about my campaign and other examples of kind of mashing up genres. Now, as I said, mine are quite compartmentalized is probably the best way to do it. So I'm like, here's the goofy one when you're up in this, floating in this high elven city. It's like Dalaran from WoW. Like there's holographic maps that people can look at that are, appearing out and of the kiosks and stuff like that. But then once that's over, like they'll go back to reality, and it will be some other theme they're going to next. I think if memory serves, the one they're going for is like a Jurassic Park kind of genre, a Lost Island, lost to time.
Yeah,
that happens to be what I've set up there
now. But you could do a little bit of genre mashing, because you've established that these other people from these other genres exist in your world.
Yeah.
So what happens if the dwarves and the elves also show up looking for something in that, sort of lost world sort of location, right? And now you've got high elven magic and the I don't know what your dwarves were like, these surly dwarves or whatever from underground in this dinosaur-laden world, and suddenly you're doing a fun genre mashup.
Yeah. No, thank you, because that is a fantastic idea.
I was only thinking of it because I was just mentioning Torg. I really like Torg Eternity, by the way. Like, I mostly play D&D, but man, do I love Torg Eternity. It is a really... So I don't know if you're familiar with the game.
No, hit me up.
So Torg Eternity was originally, I don't know, late 80s into the 90s. It was a game back then. It was actually the name Torg. It was started off as a stand-in while they were trying to figure out the name for it, and it just stood for the other role-playing game, right? Because they were trying to be the alternative to D&D or whatever, right? But then it stuck and it worked, and so then several years ago, somebody else bought the license or bought the ownership of the brand. I think actually a guy in Germany bought the brand and started his company, Ulysses Spiel. And they relaunched Torg, freshening up the mechanics, making it all sort of fit together better, whatever. It is a very sort of cinematic action story type of game, right? You can have insanely high, like 10s and 20s on a D20 roll explode.
Okay.
So if you roll a 10, you roll again, and you add it, and if you roll another 10 or a 20, you can just keep going.
Oh, I see.
And so you can end up with these insane rolls and do crazy things. But the whole concept of the game and the setting is that we're on Earth. Earth has they call it Earth in the near now. They don't really specify a certain year, right? It's just always slightly ahead of where we are right now, right? The technology is a little bit better than it is right now. So it's the near now Earth, and all of a sudden, one day, all of these other realities invaded Earth. Right? There was a coordinated strike between all these different realities, and they all suddenly invade Earth. And when they do, they change the reality of Earth in these little triangular shapes all over the map into their reality.
Okay.
And so you have your high fantasy. Sort of classic high fantasy dwarves and elves and magic and whatever up in Scandinavia and in England, most of the UK. But then just south of that in France is the cyber papacy, which is sort of a big brother's always watching you, but people are implanted with cybernetics, but it's all connected to the godnet, and the cyber pope is watching what you're doing, right? And then over in Russia, you have Tharkold, which it's a little bit Mad Max, a little bit Hellraiser. The cyber demons have invaded, and the Russians, rather than allowing... So whenever a reality invaded, they invade through what's called a maelstrom bridge, this sort of bridge, literal physical bridge that appears out of the sky and just sort of slams down in the middle of a place, and all of these invading armies come in, right? The Russians saw that maelstrom bridge appear in the middle of Moscow, and their solution was nuke it, right in the middle of their own capital city. They nuked the maelstrom bridge, which created this particulate of reality that sort of washed over and created this Mad Max sort of environment. While the cyber demons are trying to hang on to control, there's this radioactive but reality weird sort of area, right? Down in Egypt, you have the Nile Empire, which is like 1920s pulp era superheroes. Okay. Right? And so Dr. Mobius has invaded and with his armies that are clearly a metaphor for Nazis, right? But it's all sort of pseudo-Egyptian, ancient Egyptian themed. Over in India, you have Aurosh, which is a Victorian horror setting. And then North America is being invaded by the Living Land, which is your pulp era sort of Lost World, dinosaur people running around and whatever. So I thought of that again when I gave you the advice of bring the elves and the dwarves into your Lost World area, because that's the kind of thing that happens in Torg. Like you're the heroes and you're going after this MacGuffin, whatever it is, to help fight the war against these reality raiders, but inevitably, if there's something that's that valuable there, agents from these other realities are going to show up as well. And so you're going to be fighting, Egyptian Nazis and horrible evil monsters on Dragonback or whatever at the same time that you're going after this thing in I skipped a whole reality. There's in East Asia, there's Pan Pacifica, which is Megacorps and sort of a zombie plague sort of thing.
Okay.
They're not actually zombies, but it's kind of like that. And the megacorps have convinced everybody that they're your only hope, right, against this horrible zombie plague, when in fact they're the ones that have invaded from another reality. So yeah, so it is a whole game built around mashing up all these genres.
Yeah.
Like literally, you can go from one reality to another reality, and it goes from horror to superheroes through a traveling through geography.
Yeah.
Right? You just physically relocate yourself to another place, and you can have characters in your party that are from these different realities as well, who are part of the resistance and whatever.
Yeah.
Or you could be a dwarf who's gone to Tharcold and gotten so there's cybernetics in both Tharcold and the cyber papacy, and the cyber papacy ones are relatively nice, but they allow the bad guys to spy on you. Whereas the ones from Tharcold, from the cyber demons, are like, well, these are really like horrific and ugly, and they're fueled on pain. So you can go, you could be an elf who's gone and replaced an arm with a laser gun from Tharcold that just hurts every time you shoot it.
Yeah.
So you can do all kinds of weird mashups with that game. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah, that sounds it. And talking of that, reminded me that I doing myself a disservice actually, because I do have that kind of subversive mashup in my dwarfs. Funnily enough, they've done that campaign, they've done that arc, and I thought what would be often, not always, but often dwarves in pop culture are seen as very strong work ethic, very pragmatic, very industrious, like mining and producing metal and metallurgy and all that kind of stuff. And I was thinking, what is like the logical end point of that? And so basically my players like, we've got to go to the dwarven capital, and they're like, okay, you're sailing through a river that goes into a mountain, and the docks are basically like deep in the mountain. You jump off, and basically I have it so that it's ultra capitalist. There's like everything's like Walmarts and Targets and high street shops, all run by dwarves, but that's like the logical end point of like industry, just like the Industrial Revolution is this kind of late stage capitalism we find ourselves in. And so it is very much like there's a bunch of young dwarves that are working in these supermarkets essentially for like armor. So there's literally like armor on rails, weapons along the wall, like cookie cutter, just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these swords. So that was the kind of, so my players were expecting to step into this very like, dirty with like smelting and steam and anvils and furnaces and all that kind of stuff. But it was actually like super like clinically clean, bright,
sterilized.
Yeah, bright white lights everywhere, just blasting everybody with the super bright white lights. And that was a mashup of like dwarven industry, but with like modern kind of like the logical endpoint of that. And that was very fun to run from a DM's perspective. And I'm fairly certain my players enjoyed their time in that.
And what does late stage capitalism do better than look for new opportunities elsewhere in the world to go and exploit resources in those places, right?
Precisely why when you said that, I was like, that actually works way better than Jeff realizes. So they're planning to go there on ship, and I can have them as they're approaching their dock point. I might have like little like in like Tarzan, where they have the little science bases like deep in the jungle. There might be one for the elves, and then further down the coast they see one with the dwarves, and the players are going to be like, oh, okay, there's more stuff happening here. Maybe we should go and investigate. And
all these different genres you created are all in one world, and they can show up, right?
Yeah, that's pretty much what I need to do to break down that compartmentalization a little bit more, because I think that it's very easy for my players to be like, well, slam the book shut on that chapter, moving on. It's that book is burning, but we forget that book's over, so we can just forget about it. When I need to be like, no, there are consequences to your actions. Is there anything that you wanted to talk about that we might have missed in today's discussion?
I mean, I only had one other thing sort of in my bullet point notes that we could bring up, and that's the idea of mashing up monsters. Can be a lot of fun too. And sometimes you'll see published, collections of monsters, or in monster manuals, there'll be mashups of monsters and whatever. But, I guess I would just tell people, like, if you're a DM and you're looking to surprise your players, think to yourself, what would happen if so let's say a troll and Kuo-toa were mashed up into the same sort of thing, right? Mm-hmm. What happens when they're fighting the Legion of Kuo-toa, and then suddenly they find the sort of big chieftain who starts regenerating and won't die, and the only thing that can stop the regeneration is fire, but you're underwater. There's all kinds of things you can do with that as well. I mean, there's as many combinations as there are monsters that exist in different books, right? Mm-hmm. That you can be like, well, what happens if you take some of the features from this monster and match them up with that monster and create a whole new thing that isn't even necessarily just a derivative of a thing, but just a completely different monster. Your balance is all going to still kind of be there, especially if you pick two things that are relatively equal in CR. But it's a fun way to sort of surprise your players, because, like, hey, you got that player who's memorized the monster manual, but, like, this isn't a thing from the monster manual. Yeah. Well, actually, it is. It's just two things from the monster manual.
Yeah, it's a very good tip, and something, again, I probably need to do more of.
That takes a little more forethought and work.
Yeah.
I don't like to do that like on the fly, because then you don't know what you're going to get. But, like, every now and then, when you want to throw a curveball at them, or give them something that they're not expecting, or you need something to make the big boss work, or you're just creating sort of this creature that you want to sort of be a touchstone or a keystone moment.
Yeah.
That can really sort of bring the session to life or whatever. You can mash something up to give them something unique.
Mm-hmm. On that same vein, and I think we talked about it way back when we arranged this, was about multi-classing, and it is. Yeah. I'm going to keep this short, but the question I want to level at you. And it is one that I've heard on the Twitterverse a couple of times recently, around people debating the validity of a paladin and warlock multi-class.
Sure.
Often both of those classes themselves are usually regarded, pretty top tier, just standalone for various reasons. So, but a lot of the criticism is that, like, they're just thematically incompatible. And I wondered.
I would argue, if you think it's thematically incompatible, that you need to work on your creativity. Because I could tell some sort of crazy story where that makes sense. And that's kind of the fun, right? Take something that seems incompatible and then figure out how to make it work. I mean, give yourself those creative restraints and then try to bust through them. Like, that's half the fun, right? Now, I get where that's coming from, right? The warlock and the paladin are not inherently compatible, because they both serve a master, and the way those masters work out, they're probably not the same master, right? But I could certainly come up with something to make that work, right?
Where there's a will, there's a way, I like to say. I think there's probably, if you really want, unless the setting was like, focused on the oaths of paladins, really strongly, then maybe that's pushing that boundary.
I had in my Curse of Strahd Waterdeep campaign, I had a was it Divine Sorcerer?
Yeah, Divine Soul, I think. Yeah,
Divine Soul Sorcerer, who picked up like a dark warlock pact along the way. So on one hand, like, they have this guardian angel, and they have this very sort of celestial theming to them and whatever, but yet taking this dark warlock pact made a lot of sense in the story. The character is also an Asimar, so they're part celestial. They're divine soul.
Yeah.
They've got all this sort of celestial goody stuff going on. But when a dark power starts whispering in your mind and offering you new abilities to save the world and whatever, like, that starts off making sense. Like, if I can have the power to save the world, why would I turn that down?
Yeah.
It just slowly becomes darker and darker as it goes, because horrible, evil things like the dark powers or Lovecraftian creatures or whatever, like, they've got time. They can whittle, or even devils, right? They can whittle you down. They can be giving you everything you want at the beginning, and whittle you down, and slowly get you to make little compromises that then become medium-sized compromises. And then you have to make a decision, like, am I really going to make this compromise? At what point do I cross a line?
Yeah. Sunk cost fallacy. Well, I've made all these compromises so far, so what's one more?
So that becomes, I mean, taking something that feels impossible, but building a story around it to make it make sense and make it work. That's I don't know, that's the most fun kind of stories to tell in D&D in my experience. So.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for answering that question and providing such a good end to the episode. Is there anything you would like to promote?
I tell people if they want to hear more from me, I've been running a podcast for 15 years, the Tome Show. So far as I can tell, it is the longest continuously running D&D podcast around. I think the only D&D podcast I can think of that started before us was D&D focused anyway, was the official D&D podcast. But they've completely changed hosts like 3 times and changed names several times. So I'm going to say that it's a different podcast and that we're older than them. So yeah, we've been doing a lot. We've been podcasting there for a long time. TheTomeShow.com is where you can find the podcast. You can find the show on Twitter as well. It is at The Tome Show, and I am at Squatch, SQUACH, on Twitter as well.
Awesome. Well, all that's left to say is thank you ever so much for joining us today, Jeff. That was a really interesting and insightful conversation.
Yeah, it was fun. Thanks a lot.
No worries. Thank you, everybody, to listening at home. The Tome Show and all of Jeff's socials will be in the episode description as per usual, so I would encourage you to check them all out. I got to set a reminder for me to message Jeff in 14 years when I'll also be my 15-year anniversary of this show, just so I can...
And then I'll be doing it for like 29 years. I'll be in my 60s by then, but yeah.
So as usual, please check out all of Jeff's stuff and check everything in the episode description. Otherwise... thank you all for listening, and good night. And now it's time for the Patreon shoutouts. Once again, thank you to Matt Street at mpstreet88 on Twitter for supporting the show. If you need support running your personal or business schedule, head to virtualtimehustle.com or on Instagram to make that difference between should do and done. Boss it better with support from Kat, who will help you get back that essential time you've been searching for. If you would like to support what we do and get 4 shoutouts a month, head over to patreon.com/thinkingcritically, or you can just buy me a coffee at ko-fi.com/thinkingcritically. Thank you, bye!